The reckoning, when politics becomes personal. The stark fluorescent lights of Studio 7 at the American Pulse headquarters cast long shadows as two of Washington's most formidable women took their positions across from each other. The air, thick with anticipation, seemed to crackle with the electricity of impending conflict. Karoline Leavitt, the newly minted White House press secretary, adjusted her microphone with practiced precision, her eyes revealing nothing but the cold calculation of someone who had come prepared for war. Across from her, Karine Jean-Pierre, whose tenure as press secretary had ended amid controversy and whose legacy remained contested territory, straightened her notes with hands that betrayed the slightest tremor. This wasn't just another cable news segment. This was the culmination of months of political tension, of policies dissected, and legacies questioned. The nation, polarized and hungry for clarity, had tuned in by the millions. "What we're witnessing," whispered a senior producer to his assistant director, "is the collision of two Americas." Indeed, as the floor director counted down silently from 5, the studio became a microcosm of the nation's ideological divide. Leavitt embodied the Trump administration's unapologetic approach to governance, results-driven, uncompromising, and dismissive of what they termed political theater. Her rise from communications specialist to the presidential podium had been meteoric, fueled by an uncanny ability to distill complex policy into digestible soundbites that resonated with the base. Jean-Pierre, meanwhile, carried the weight of the Biden years, a period increasingly viewed through the lens of unfulfilled promises and economic uncertainty. Once celebrated for breaking barriers as the first Black and openly LGBTQ+ press secretary, she now found herself defending decisions that history had begun to question. 3, 2, 1. The red light flashed, and America's living rooms were instantly transported to the epicenter of political warfare. "Welcome to a special edition of the American Pulse," the moderator began, his voice carrying the gravity of the moment. "Tonight, a rare face-to-face conversation between the voice of the current administration and one of its most vocal critics." The battle lines were drawn before the first question was even posed. Leavitt sat forward, her posture signaling an offensive stance, while Jean-Pierre adopted the defensive position familiar to those who had watched her parry reporters' questions during her time at the podium. When the discussion turned to the economy, the bleeding wound in America's current political discourse, Leavitt struck with surgical precision. "The American people don't need more explanations or excuses," she asserted, her voice a controlled weapon. "They need results." Under the previous administration, families watched their savings evaporate, while Washington debated semantics about what constitutes a recession. Jean-Pierre's response came with the measured cadence of someone choosing each word carefully, aware of its potential to become tomorrow's headline. What the former press secretary conveniently omits is the global context of economic challenges that every nation faced. Recovery doesn't happen overnight, and the foundations we laid— "Foundations?" Leavitt interrupted, her incredulity slicing through Jean-Pierre's carefully constructed narrative. "The only foundation I see is the rubble of failed policies that we're now rebuilding from." In the control room, producers watched the real-time social media response explode. Conservative outlets were already framing the exchange as a dismantling of the Democratic legacy, while progressive platforms rallied to Jean-Pierre's defense, citing the complexity of governance versus the simplicity of criticism. But beyond the partisan noise, something more profound was unfolding. The audience wasn't simply witnessing a debate about policy differences. They were seeing the embodiment of America's increasingly incompatible visions for its future. In Leavitt's assertive challenges lay the promise of decisive leadership in uncertain times. In Jean-Pierre's measured responses lingered the echo of nuance in an era that increasingly rejected it. As the first commercial break approached, the tension had only intensified. Jean-Pierre's notes remained largely untouched, her responses increasingly coming from personal conviction rather than prepared talking points, a shift that both humanized and exposed her. Leavitt, meanwhile, had yet to reference her materials, relying instead on a command of data points and statistics that created an aura of irrefutable authority. "We'll continue this conversation when we return," the moderator promised as the broadcast cut to commercial. But in the brief silence that followed, with cameras momentarily off, Leavitt leaned slightly forward, her gaze fixed on Jean-Pierre with an intensity that suggested the real confrontation was just beginning. The former press secretary met that gaze unflinchingly, a silent acknowledgement passing between them. This wasn't just political theater, it was a battle for America's narrative, for who would write the next chapter of a nation's story. And as the floor director began the countdown for their return from break, one thing became abundantly clear. By night's end, only one vision of America would emerge victorious in the court of public opinion. The stakes had never been higher, and the country, divided yet united in its attention, held its collective breath for what would come next. The Showdown, Leavitt's moment of reckoning. The second segment began with an intensity that made the first exchange seem like mere prologue. Karoline Leavitt leaned forward, her posture transforming the wooden desk into a prosecutor's table. The studio lights caught the determination in her eyes as she unfurled what would become the centerpiece of the confrontation. "Let's talk about results," she began, her voice carrying the quiet assurance of someone holding a royal flush. "Under President Trump's leadership, we saw the strongest economy in decades, the lowest unemployment for minority communities in American history, and energy independence that liberated our foreign policy options." The statistics flowed from her with machine gun precision, facts deployed not merely as information but as ammunition. Each data point struck with clinical accuracy, targeting the vulnerabilities in the previous administration's narrative. The audience, initially reserved, began to stir with recognition. "These aren't partisan talking points," Leavitt continued, her cadence accelerating with practiced conviction. "These are the lived realities of Americans who found themselves with more opportunities, more security, and more confidence in their future." Across the table, Karine Jean-Pierre's expression remained composed, though the slight twitch of her hand betrayed the internal calculation happening behind her diplomatic veneer. She had weathered countless storms from the White House podium, but Leavitt's barrage carried the weight of what increasingly felt like vindicated history. "We govern by results, not rhetoric," Leavitt pressed, each word falling like a hammer on an anvil. While the American people struggled with inflation rates we hadn't seen in 40 years, they watched press briefings where legitimate concerns were dismissed as, quote, transitory, or blamed on global factors beyond control. The camera caught Jean-Pierre's momentary glance toward her untouched notes, a visual tell that spoke volumes about the asymmetry of preparation in this pivotal moment. The former press secretary had arrived ready to defend policies. Leavitt had come to dismantle them. "The difference," Leavitt said, lowering her voice to a register that demanded attentive silence, "is accountability. When policies fail, we acknowledge, adjust, and advance. We don't deflect, distract, or blame." Somewhere in the third row, a man in a navy suit nodded approvingly. The gesture spread like a contagion through sections of the audience. Subtle at first, then unmistakable. The room was becoming a physical manifestation of the nation's ideological landscape, territories being claimed in real time. Jean-Pierre, drawing on years of crisis management experience, attempted to recalibrate the conversation. "Historical context matters," she countered, her voice carrying the measured authority that had once guided the nation through pandemic updates. "The economic challenges we faced were unprecedented, a global economic shutdown, followed by supply chain disruptions that affected every nation on Earth. But Leavitt was prepared for this familiar defense. Context is precisely what Americans are asking for," she interjected. "The context of promises made versus results delivered. The context of policies implemented versus lives improved." The exchange escalated as Leavitt methodically contrasted border security statistics, highlighting surges in illegal crossings and the humanitarian implications that followed. When she turned to energy policy, comparing gas prices and American energy production metrics under both administrations, there was an audible reaction from the audience, not the theatrical applause of partisan rallies, but the more significant sound of realization rippling through the collective consciousness. "These aren't just numbers," Leavitt emphasized, her gaze now directly engaging the cameras and, by extension, the millions of Americans watching at home. "These are the measurements of leadership." The audience's response was spontaneous, not a standing ovation, but something perhaps more meaningful in its authenticity, the reluctant acknowledgement of uncomfortable truths. Even those who had arrived skeptical of Leavitt's narrative found themselves confronted with data points that transcended partisan framing. In the control room, producers exchanged glances that communicated what they wouldn't say aloud. They were witnessing not just compelling television, but a potential inflection point in the public conversation about governance and accountability. As Jean-Pierre prepared her response, her expression revealed the calculation of a seasoned political communicator who recognized that this moment demanded more than rehearsed talking points. The battlefield had shifted, and with it, the strategies required for survival. The moderator, sensing the pivotal nature of what was unfolding, glanced at his notes but decided against interrupting the organic tension building between these two emblematic figures. Some moments in political discourse transcend format, becoming instead the raw material of history being written in real time. Leavitt, having delivered her methodical deconstruction, now sat back slightly, not in retreat, but in the confident posture of someone who had just laid the foundation for what would come next. The audience, the moderator, even Jean-Pierre herself seemed to collectively understand. This was merely the opening salvo in what would become a defining confrontation about not just who would lead America, but what vision of leadership Americans would demand in the uncertain future that awaited them all. The Freedom Doctrine, Leavitt's unyielding defense of free speech. As the third act of the confrontation unfolded, the atmosphere in the studio crystallized into something more consequential than mere political theater. The air itself seemed charged with ideological voltage, as Karoline Leavitt pivoted toward a subject that would prove to be the philosophical fulcrum of the entire exchange. "Let's address what's at stake beyond policy disagreements," Leavitt said, her voice dropping to a register that commanded attention. "The foundational principle of free expression, the cornerstone of American democracy, is being systematically undermined." The studio lights caught the steely determination in her eyes as she methodically laid out a case that transcended partisan boundaries. This wasn't about right versus left anymore. This was about the constitutional architecture that enabled the very debate they were having. "When government officials collaborate with technology companies to suppress legitimate discourse," she continued, "we've crossed a threshold our founders explicitly warned against." Jean-Pierre shifted in her seat, the subtle movement betraying an awareness that they had entered dangerous territory. The former press secretary had defended countless policy positions from behind the White House podium, but the constitutional questions Leavitt was raising struck at the legitimacy of governance itself. "There's a profound difference," Leavitt pressed, "between combating harmful misinformation and orchestrating a system where certain viewpoints are preemptively silenced." She referenced internal communications between administration officials and social media executives, documents that had emerged through congressional oversight and judicial discovery. The evidence was laid out not with theatrical flourish, but with prosecutorial precision, emails, texts, and meeting notes that formed a damning mosaic. "Americans understand the difference between protecting democracy and protecting those in power from criticism," Leavitt said. "And that distinction is exactly what's at stake in our national conversation." Jean-Pierre's response came with the measured cadence of someone navigating a rhetorical minefield. "Context matters," she began, echoing her earlier defensive posture. "The unprecedented challenges of coordinated foreign disinformation, public health crises, and domestic extremism required unprecedented coordination." But the justification rang hollow against Leavitt's constitutional framing. This was the vulnerability in Jean-Pierre's armor. When defensive pragmatism collided with first principles, the former rarely emerged unscathed. "The First Amendment doesn't have a crisis exception," Leavitt countered, leaning slightly forward. Her voice remained measured, but carried an intensity that seemed to physically compress the space between them. "Every authoritarian regime in history has justified censorship as necessary for security or stability." The audience's collective posture had changed. This wasn't spectacle anymore. It was a master class in the fundamental tension between governance and liberty. Even those who had arrived sympathetic to Jean-Pierre found themselves confronting uncomfortable questions about where precisely the line between protecting democracy and controlling discourse should be drawn. "Our administration believes in the American people's capacity to evaluate information themselves," Leavitt continued. "We don't need a government-approved filter on reality." The camera caught Jean-Pierre's momentary hesitation, a fraction of a second that spoke volumes. She had prepared for attacks on policy outcomes, economic indicators, and foreign policy decisions. But Leavitt had elevated the conversation to constitutional first principles, terrain where defensive talking points offer little shelter. "The distinction," Jean-Pierre finally responded, "between harmful demonstrably false information and legitimate dissent is one we take seriously." But Leavitt was prepared for this well-worn defense. "The question isn't whether you take it seriously," she replied. "The question is, who gets to be the arbiter of truth? The Constitution's answer is clear: not the government." In the control room, producers recognized they were capturing something rare in modern political discourse. A confrontation not about polling or positioning, but about the philosophical underpinnings of American governance itself. This wasn't just compelling television, it was a distillation of the central tension in contemporary democratic societies. Freedom isn't just another value to be balanced against security or efficiency, Leavitt said, her voice now carrying a quiet but unmistakable passion. It's the prerequisite for all other values in a democratic society. Across the studio, viewers could sense the culmination of something significant, not just a political exchange, but a definitive articulation of competing visions for America's future. As Jean-Pierre prepared her response, the unspoken question hanging in the air wasn't simply who had won this particular verbal joust, but what vision of America would prevail in the national consciousness after the cameras stopped rolling. The Freedom Doctrine that Leavitt had articulated wasn't merely a campaign message, it was a constitutional gauntlet thrown down at the feet of an administration increasingly perceived as having strayed from first principles. And as the moderator prepared to transition to the next segment, the tension in the studio suggested that the most consequential exchanges still lay ahead. A confrontation, not just between two political figures, but between competing understandings of what America itself was meant to be. The digital battleground, the weight of public verdict. As Karoline Leavitt delivered her constitutional broadside, something shifted in the studio, not just in the argument, but in the collective consciousness of those witnessing it. The audience, initially divided along predictable partisan lines, began to coalesce around the clarity of her message. A murmur rippled through the crowd, heads nodded in agreement. Occasional bursts of spontaneous applause punctuated her points with exclamation marks of validation. This wasn't the manufactured enthusiasm of campaign rallies or the coordinated support of political theater. It was something more organic, the gravitational pull of conviction drawing the undecided toward its center of mass. "Look at their faces," whispered a producer in the control room, gesturing toward the monitor, showing audience reactions. "We're not watching politics anymore. We're watching a verdict being rendered in real time." Karine Jean-Pierre, veteran of 1,000 press briefings, sensed the momentum shifting away from her like sand through fingers. Her eyes darted briefly toward her notes, a reflexive gesture that cameras caught and amplified. In the unforgiving language of television, it translated as uncertainty. The former press secretary had entered this arena, armed with the administration's carefully constructed narrative, a mosaic of economic indicators, global partnerships, and progressive achievements. But Leavitt had changed the battlefield, shifting from policy outcomes to constitutional first principles. And on this terrain, Jean-Pierre found herself increasingly isolated, defended only by talking points that suddenly seemed hollow against the architecture of Leavitt's argument. In the third row, a woman who had arrived wearing a Biden-Harris button was now leaning forward, her expression reflecting not conversion but genuine contemplation. Beside her, a man nodded slowly, his face a canvas of reconsideration. These micro-reactions, multiplied across the audience, formed a visible referendum that no polling could capture. "Ms. Jean-Pierre, would you like to respond?" the moderator prompted, recognizing the dangerous silence that had emerged. "Of course," Jean-Pierre replied, her voice steady but carrying the unmistakable weight of someone suddenly playing defense. The characterization that Ms. Leavitt offers simplifies complex issues of national security and public health that a subtle but audible sigh from somewhere in the audience interrupted her response. It wasn't hostile or theatrical, just the involuntary sound of expectations deflating. Leavitt remained still, her posture neither triumphant nor combative. This wasn't about her winning. It was about principles prevailing. The distinction was subtle but critical, and the audience recognized it instinctively. In Washington's ecosystem of political operatives, a text message circulated, "KJP underwater. LL bringing oxygen masks." Within minutes, supportive tweets began appearing from progressive commentators, attempting to reframe the narrative as Jean-Pierre standing firm against right-wing talking points. But the digital countermeasures felt hollow against the visceral reality unfolding on screen. What viewers witnessed wasn't a tactical victory in the endless chess game of politics, but something more fundamental, the exposure of an ideological fault line that no amount of messaging could disguise. "We need to take a brief break," the moderator announced, recognizing that Jean-Pierre needed respite. "We'll continue this conversation in just a moment." As the red lights on cameras blinked off, indicating commercial break, Jean-Pierre's staff rushed to her side, a huddle of whispered advice and hastily revised strategies. Across the stage, Leavitt declined similar consultation from her team, instead remaining seated, reviewing her notes with the composure of someone who had mapped the terrain before the battle began. In the production truck, the director studied the audience reaction shots, selecting the most telling for emphasis when the broadcast resumed. "Stay on that woman in the third row," he instructed. "Her face tells the whole story." What had begun as a standard political confrontation had evolved into something more consequential, a moment when the theoretical abstractions of governance collided with the concrete realities of public sentiment. As the stage manager counted down to their return from commercial, the tension in the studio wasn't about who would speak next, but about whether the fundamental dynamics of the exchange had been permanently altered. The red lights blinked on. Cameras refocused. The moderator gathered his thoughts. But the verdict had already been rendered in the court of public opinion, visible in the attentive postures, the nodding heads, and the subtle but unmistakable shift in energy toward Leavitt's position. In the unspoken language of audiences, support had found its voice without saying a word. "Welcome back," the moderator began, his tone suggesting awareness that they were now navigating different waters. "Ms. Jean-Pierre, you wanted to offer a response to Ms. Leavitt's characterization of," but before Jean-Pierre could speak, the next phase of this political chess match was about to unfold, one that would test whether recovery was possible once the public had glimpsed the distance between principle and practice. The final blow, Leavitt's calculated checkmate. As the debate resumed, the atmosphere in the studio had crystallized into something almost tangible, a mounting pressure that seemed to compress the very air around Karine Jean-Pierre. Her notes, once a scaffold of administrative talking points, now resembled the remnants of a collapsing structure. The former press secretary's fingers trembled slightly as she arranged them, a micro-movement captured by cameras and broadcast to millions. Across the stage, Karoline Leavitt prepared to deliver her closing statement with the measured patience of a prosecutor who knows the jury has already begun internal deliberations. Her hands rested calmly on the podium, neither gripping in tension nor gesturing in excess, the physical embodiment of a mind at ease with its convictions. "In conclusion," Leavitt began, her voice calibrated to the perfect frequency between authority and accessibility, "what we've witnessed under the previous administration wasn't simply policy failure, it was constitutional abdication." She paused, allowing the weight of the accusation to settle across the studio. The audience, now a unified organism rather than a collection of partisan observers, leaned forward collectively. Even those who had arrived wearing Biden-Harris buttons found themselves drawn into the gravitational well of her argument. "When a government prioritizes ideological outcomes over constitutional constraints," she continued, "it doesn't just fail politically, it betrays its fundamental compact with the American people." The camera caught Jean-Pierre's jaw tightening, the subtle flexing of muscles beneath her carefully applied makeup. Her staff, watching from the wings, exchanged glances loaded with recognition that damage control was no longer possible, only damage assessment. "The numbers I've presented tonight aren't Republican numbers or Democratic numbers," Leavitt said, gesturing toward the data displayed on the screens behind her. "They're American realities: inflation that eroded working-class savings, border policies that overwhelmed communities, foreign policy retreats that emboldened adversaries." In the control room, the director whispered into his headset, "Stay on, Jean-Pierre, this is the moment." The camera obediently tightened on the former press secretary's face, documenting in unforgiving high definition the subtle collapse happening behind her eyes. Not a collapse of character or courage, but of narrative coherence. The administration's carefully constructed rationales were disintegrating under the weight of Leavitt's methodical dismantlement. "Perhaps most troubling," Leavitt continued, her voice dropping to a register that forced everyone to listen more intently, was the willingness to use federal agencies as instruments of political leverage rather than public service. In Washington offices, phones began buzzing. Congressional aides exchanged urgent text messages. Media outlets prepared split-screen analyses. This wasn't merely another political skirmish. It was evolving into a defining moment that would echo through campaign ads, donor emails, and voter conversations for months to come. "Ms. Jean-Pierre represents an administration that asked Americans to disbelieve their lived experience," Leavitt said, her gaze now directly meeting her opponent's. "To accept narrative over reality. To embrace rhetoric over results." Jean-Pierre's hand moved toward her water glass, but stopped midway, perhaps recognizing that even this gesture might be interpreted as uncertainty. Instead, she straightened her posture, an instinctive attempt to physically counterbalance what was becoming an intellectual rout. "The American people," Leavitt stated, her voice gathering quiet force rather than volume, "deserve leadership that respects not just their votes, but their intelligence." In living rooms across America, viewers of different political persuasions experienced the rare sensation of witnessing not just effective messaging, but authentic conviction. Conservative households nodded in vindication, progressive homes fell into contemplative silence. Independent voters felt the subtle shift in their internal political compasses. "Madam Moderator," Jean-Pierre interjected suddenly, her voice carrying a hint of desperation beneath its professional veneer. "I'd like to address these characterizations." "You'll have your opportunity for closing remarks next," the moderator replied, her tone reflecting the institutional neutrality that had abandoned Jean-Pierre in spirit, if not in procedure. Leavitt acknowledged this exchange with nothing more than a measured blink, then delivered her final words with surgical precision. "When this administration took office, we promised accountability, transparency, and results. Tonight, I've shown you the evidence that we're delivering on that promise. The previous administration offered explanations, we offer solutions." The silence that followed wasn't empty, it was filled with the invisible transmission of a message that required no further elaboration. Jean-Pierre faced not just the challenge of responding to points made, but of reassembling a worldview that had been methodically deconstructed before a national audience. As she prepared to speak, the former press secretary became acutely aware that she was no longer defending policies or decisions, she was fighting for the very legitimacy of an administration's place in history. The red light on the camera facing her burned with unblinking intensity, waiting to document whether this would be a moment of remarkable recovery or the final confirmation of a narrative that had already escaped her control. The nation held its breath, sensing that what would follow wasn't merely a response, but a verdict on two fundamentally different visions of American governance, one that had been tried and judged, and another that was being written in real time before their eyes.